Kevin Noonan-Fick asks, what are your thoughts on nootropic cognitive enhancing supplements, and do you take any yourself? For example, choline, lion's mane mushroom, etc. I do take some things that might qualify as nootropics. I am, however, very cautious in what I choose to experiment with, at least over the long term. My biggest concern comes down to one simple fact. When we introduce outside compounds that too directly perturb complex biological systems, we opened up the possibility of triggering feedback systems that can then result in unintended consequences, such as receptor downregulation. What do I mean by that? For example, let's say we take a pharmacological drug that inhibits transporters that reuptake and metabolize neurotransmitters. This causes these neurotransmitters to then stay around in the synapse for a longer period of time, exerting more biological effects. This might be perceived as a good thing. But the trade-off is that this causes the receptors that bind to these various neurotransmitters, which is how they actually exert their biological effect, to decrease in number. This is what we call downregulation. So what happens when you do not take that same drug for a few days? Your baseline level has changed so that in the absence of those drugs that inhibit reuptake, your neurotransmitters will not by themselves exert the same effect that they might have had before your pharmacological intervention, due to the changes in receptor density or the number of receptors we have for the neurotransmitter to interact with. This is one reason why I prefer to instead focus primarily in the realm of nutrition, since it usually works a little bit more indirectly by providing compounds that are found in and needed by the body, and in the context of this conversation, the brain. Additionally, when compounds are identified in food, such as xenohormetic compounds, we have a better chance of achieving benefit without deleterious effects because of the fact that we've likely evolved alongside the presence of that compound. If the compound or compounds don't have that same history, it takes a little bit more scrutiny before we can be sure that there isn't some sort of significant side effect we just haven't taken the time to observe yet. Maybe we won't even know about it for years. For this reason, I tend to stay away from compounds that are inhibitors of enzymes in the brain, which I know are ubiquitously found in many nootropic stacks. Even though they likely work in the short term, we don't have any good evidence of what, if any, long-term effects that may occur. With that said, there are some nootropics that I have tried. Choline is one of them. Choline can be either used to make acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that connects neurons together, or phosphatidylcholine or methyl groups. In humans, choline supplements increase choline plasma levels within 1 hour after ingestion, and with brain concentrations peaking around 2 hours until at least up to 3 hours after ingestion. Choline effects on the cholinergic peripheral system peaks between 1 and 2 hours after ingestion. Choline itself, without forming acetylcholine, acts on a subtype of nicotinic receptors called alpha-7 nicotinic receptor that is involved in long-term memory. Acetylcholine also acts on all the nicotinic receptors. Choline does not cause desensitization of this receptor like other agonists do, like nicotine, for example. In fact, supplementing with choline increases this receptor subtype. Certain neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease are linked to decreased acetylcholine, so there has been a lot of interest in investigating whether certain choline supplements and other compounds that affect the cholinergic system can improve cognition and memory in people with cognitive decline and dementia and Alzheimer's disease, for example. There are different forms of choline supplements, but I think the choline that is complex to phosphatidylcholine is the best because it is 12 times more bioavailable and gets into the brain faster. There's a decent body of evidence that has looked at the effects of various types of choline on brain function. L-alpha glycerylphosphorylcholine, more commonly known as alpha-GPC, is a naturally occurring form of choline and is thought to be a form of choline that crosses the blood-brain barrier quickly. I came across this compound when doing a literature review of various phospholipids and their role in Alzheimer's disease. The study that put this on the map was an old study published in 2003 that demonstrated 1,200 milligrams a day split up over 3 daily doses was able to enhance cognitive performance and slow cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients. The problem is this study was done in Mexico City 13 years ago. Since then, another study in 2011 attempted to repeat this, but in addition to alpha-GPC, about 10 other compounds were given. It improved cognitive function, but it's impossible to pinpoint this effect specifically to alpha-GPC. Finally, there is yet another interesting study that showed that alpha-GPC, along with other natural compounds, reduced reaction times and prevented mental exhaustion after intense exercise, an effect that is likely due to the replenishment of choline that is actually temporarily reduced in the brain as a consequence of endurance exercise, such as long runs. I have personally tried alpha-GPC before at a dose of around 600 milligrams a day, an amount that is half the dose that was given to the demented patients in Mexico City, and I noticed that it did seem to improve my focus and attention. You should always leave a little room for the possibility that there may be a placebo effect, but since it's my anecdote, a smaller dose of 300 milligrams didn't really seem to have much of an effect on me. In general, I do not take alpha-GPC every day. I take it on rare occasions when I'm doing a lot of writing or if there's some sort of event that I'm speaking at. There is another popular form of choline called CDP choline, which is an intermediate produced during the generation of phosphatidylcholine from choline. There are a couple of human studies looking at the effects of CDP choline in cognitive function of healthy young or middle-aged adults, usually in the range of around 1,000 milligrams a day. The only benefits were seen in young adults that had poor processing speed and verbal memory tests at baseline. Strangely, those individuals that performed well at baseline actually had impaired performance after supplementation, which may have to do with genetic variants in the receptor density or something, which just sort of goes to show you how complicated neurobiology is and how even seemingly straightforward relationships can turn out to be not so straightforward. I have personally tried CDP choline and never really noticed any enhancing effect like I seem to with alpha-GPC. The other nootropic that I have tried and use semi-frequently is Yamabushi take extract, which is also more commonly known as lion's mane. The main active compound in lion's mane is haricinones, which is found in the fruit body of the mushroom. This compound is capable of activating nerve growth factor. Nerve growth factor is essential for the growth of new neurons and survival of existing neurons. Nerve growth factor acts on the cholinergic neurons in the central nervous system. What got me interested in lion's mane as a nootropic was a Japanese study, which was a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial where elderly men with cognitive decline were given 1 gram doses of 96% Yamabushi take dry powder 3 times a day for 16 weeks for a total of 3 grams a day. Those individuals given the lion's mane extract but not placebo had a significant improvement in cognitive function at weeks 8, 12, and 16 of the trial. But the cognitive effect wore off 4 weeks after discontinuing the treatment, suggesting that a continuous intake was necessary to maintain the effect, at least in cognitively impaired older adults. Lately, I do use lion's mane extract pretty regularly from Four Sigmatic. They come in packets, and each packet contains around 1.5 grams of lion's mane extract from the fruit body only, which would contain haricinones. I have no affiliation with them. They sent me some free packets a couple of years ago, and I like them, so I continue to buy them. When I use them, which only again happens to be during periods of intense writing or creative work, I actually use 2 packets, a dose that is around 3 grams of lion's mane extract, and the same dose used in the clinical study I mentioned a moment ago out of Japan. No discussion of nootropics would be complete if I didn't at least briefly mention 2 hobby horses of mine, vitamin D and omega-3. The effects of both of these are pretty far-reaching and extend far, far beyond the realms of just cognition. But even if one were only concerned with just cognition, they would still both have special relevance. First, let's talk vitamin D. This one is near and dear to my heart since it was my in silico work that actually identified that vitamin D affects serotonin production, which I believe has very far-reaching implications, not just for adults trying to stay healthy and live optimally, but also for neurodevelopmental disorders as well, where impaired serotonin production may be particularly important for early brain development when the fetus relies on the mother as its source for vitamin D. A whopping nearly 70% of people in the United States can be classified as vitamin D insufficient, and that includes pregnant women. Okay, returning to the main topic after that brief digression, vitamin D is something that should be periodically monitored by a blood test in order to titrate to a dose that is appropriate. I personally shoot for 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter since there have been a few all-cause mortality studies that seem to indicate that this may be a so-called sweet spot. Because vitamin D can be toxic in the high upper ranges, doing too much can also be problematic. It's an absolute fact that what may work for one person, especially in terms of dose, may not for another because of the individual variation involved and can affect how deficient you are, including genetic polymorphisms, weight, age, the latitude at which you live, ethnicity, how much time you spend outdoors, whether or not you wear sunscreen, and so many other things. I've personally found that the tolerable upper intake level recommended by the Institute of Medicine of just 4,000 IUs, usually taken with a vitamin K2 supplement, is actually the amount that lands me right in the middle of that target range. That said, I'm probably not even in the highest risk category for vitamin D deficiency. Next, a quick mention for omega-3. Approximately 8% of the brain's weight is actually omega-3. The number of studies that demonstrate optimizing intake of omega-3 has some effect on cognition or behavior are extremely diverse. Today, we've talked a little bit about nerve growth factors. So just by way of example, I literally ran across an animal study that showed that supplemental omega-3 increases nerve growth factor, which increases the enzyme responsible for producing acetylcholine. It also increases vascular endothelial growth factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and has generally been shown to improve cognition. But I'll talk a little bit more about this in another question. Getting past all the usual suspects on our list of nootropics here, the other nootropic that I actually take frequently is sulforaphane. It's not even usually considered a nootropic by most people, but I think it has potential to be considered at least a mild nootropic for a variety of reasons. One of the best reasons to make this argument is the fact that sulforaphane crosses the blood-brain barrier, at least in mice. This is the first criteria that a substance must meet in order for there to be a compelling argument that it somehow exerts effects on the brain. But in addition to that, it also affects the activities of the immune system, which is now known to affect the brain through a series of lymphatic vessels. This new understanding of the immune system's ability to interact with the brain also helps to explain why manipulating levels of systemic inflammation has, in clinical trials, been shown to affect feelings of depression, either inducing depression in the presence of an artificial increase in activity in the immune system by injecting things like interferons into human trial participants, or reducing depression caused by this artificial increase in inflammation through the co-administration of natural anti-inflammatories such as icosapentaenoic acid, better known as the omega-3 fatty acid EPA. In addition to sulforaphane crossing the blood-brain barrier in mice, the compound has been shown in a couple of randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled studies in humans to have one sort of effect or another on brain and behavior. For example, treatment with sulforaphane extracted from broccoli sprouts at doses ranging from around 9 milligrams to 25 milligrams, which is an amount that might be found in around 65 grams of fresh broccoli sprouts on the high end, was able to improve autistic behavior checklist scores by 34% and significantly improved social interaction, abnormal behavior, and verbal communication in young men with autism spectrum disorder. Similarly, some measurable effects have been shown in a small trial of people with schizophrenia. The fact that sulforaphane is exhibiting clear effects on the brain and behavior of people, such as those with autism spectrum disorder, hints that it might continue to show promise in other areas of cognition too. This is because animal studies have really shown a diversity of very interesting effects on the brain that are really just waiting to be replicated in humans. For example, sulforaphane has been shown to improve spatial working memory and short-term memory in mice in the context of conditions that can affect memory in a deleterious way, such as Alzheimer's disease. It has been shown to increase neurite outgrowth, which is how damaged neurons and synapses repair themselves after damage from traumatic brain injury. The effect of sulforaphane on a rodent model of Alzheimer's disease in some respects is particularly interesting, because if we go back to our conversation a little bit earlier about the potential choline may have for mitigating some of the negative effects of this disorder, sulforaphane has also been shown to significantly reduce memory impairment that has been experimentally induced by a drug that works specifically by interfering with the effects of acetylcholine in the nervous system, a drug known as scopolamine. Sulforaphane was, in this animal trial to which I'm referring to, able to improve the cholinergic system by increasing acetylcholine levels, decreasing acetylcholine esterase activity, and increasing choline acetyltransferase, which is the enzyme responsible for synthesizing acetylcholine in the hippocampus and frontal cortex. This ties in nicely with some of our discussion earlier about the potential importance of choline system in cognition. Finally, sulforaphane has been shown to have a positive effect on mood and alleviated depressive symptoms and anxiety as effectively as the antidepressant Prozac in a mouse model of depression, and I understand that there is at least one trial currently in the beginning stages looking to confirm this effect in humans as well. If you consider that the variety of brain and other behavioral effects demonstrated already in humans, I'm optimistically hoping that some of the groups out there working on these questions will have something good to show for it in the near future. If you're looking to supplement sulforaphane, there's a few options available. First of all, the most confusing thing that is necessary to understand when gauging the various supplements for usefulness is that sulforaphane is made from a precursor known as glucoraphanin. Many supplements on the market are actually just glucoraphanin. You know this because it either says glucoraphanin on the bottle or it says sulforaphane glucosinate, which is actually somewhat confusingly just another name for glucoraphanin. Then there are a few supplements on the market that is glucoraphanin and the enzyme needed to convert it into sulforaphane, an enzyme called myrosinase. One example of this combination is a product known as Avmacol. Finally, there's an actual stabilized sulforaphane. This includes a French product that hasn't been introduced to the US yet, known as Prostaphane. These three categories of products that I've mentioned have very, very large differences in terms of bioavailability. Around 10% on average for glucoraphanin by itself, 40% for the glucoraphanin and myrosinase combination, and then around 70% for the stabilized sulforaphane. By the way, I have no affiliation with any of those supplement brands I just mentioned. The dosage range that strikes me as particularly interesting because they have shown up often in clinical trials range between 30 to 60 milligrams of sulforaphane a day. These doses, however, actually make most of the supplements out there somewhat costly in my opinion. The good news is that many studies seem to be showing promise even at a lower dose. And if you're doing an N of 1 experiment, it may be useful to be able to get a reliable product like the ones I just mentioned. That said, this cost factor has been a big reason for why I've simply taken up growing broccoli sprouts at home, which is extremely inexpensive. The main challenge being keeping a clean environment with little possibility of contamination from pathogenic bacteria, which can definitely happen. Some estimates land fresh broccoli sprouts at a concentration of about 1 gram fresh weight to about 0.45 milligrams of sulforaphane, but it depends on seed quality and genetic background, the age of the sprouts, how you consume the sprouts, whether you froze them and threw them immediately into a blender, which is what I tend to do, and tends to increase the amount of sulforaphane derived, or if you instead just chew them up the good old-fashioned way. The drawback to using sprouts is that dosing them becomes tricky. The fact of the matter is that I found my own personal digestion is probably a more reliable source of feedback than trying to work out the dosage math. That's kind of embarrassingly imprecise, I have to admit, but it just comes down to the fact that there's a tremendous number of variables that can influence how much sulforaphane in a given dose of broccoli sprouts, and on top of that, what an appropriate amount of sulforaphane to even supplement is. I've been known to consume up to 4 ounces of broccoli sprouts a few times a week, and I will likely continue for the foreseeable future. That said, there are concerns that isothiocyanates like sulforaphane may reduce iodine uptake by the thyroid gland. While right now, I don't think the evidence is especially strong that this is cause for great concern unless a person is iodine deficient, which is an uncommon deficiency, it may be prudent to exercise some degree of caution. Some of the effects of these compounds present in cruciferous vegetables and broccoli sprouts in particular are persistent for several days, so you don't necessarily need to take an extreme approach in order to reap some benefit. Again, run it by your doctor, etc., etc. Okay, on to the next question, which is somewhat related. Jez Theory asks, is one able to cold press juice broccoli sprouts and still receive high amounts of sulforaphane from ingesting it this way? To answer your question, yes, you should be able to cold press broccoli sprouts and make a juice. The myrosinase enzyme, which again is needed to activate sulforaphane, begins to get activated once you cold press the sprouts because by cold pressing, you are breaking open plant cell walls and causing the mixing of glucoraphanin in the plant with the myrosinase enzyme, which is stored away in specialized vacuoles. This mixing then allows sulforaphane to form. Ultimately, you would not be getting the same dietary fiber, which is why I prefer to blend things rather than juice them, but the sulforaphane would be concentrated, and since it may be less aversive, it seems like an interesting option. Next question is from William McGrath. Besides a low-carb diet, which reduces inflammation, what is the most effective non-pharmaceutical pain reliever for arthritis sport injury sufferers? Okay, William's question here is an interesting one. The reason for that is because of the fact that many NSAIDs, as in non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which are often used for mild pain relief, are actually not especially safe to take on a daily basis. This is even more true of people that tend to take them in larger than recommended doses, and is why the FDA recently strengthened their warning that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, again known as NSAIDs, with the exception to aspirin, significantly increase the risk of heart attack or stroke, even with short-term use. What these NSAIDs, including ibuprofen, that cause this increased risk have in common is that they all inhibit COX-2, an enzyme involved in inflammation and pain. There are a few fundamental mechanisms that increase the risk of heart attack and stroke. First, NSAIDs that inhibit COX-2 inhibit the production of a molecule called prostacyclin, which is produced by COX-2 and relaxes blood vessels and sort of unglues platelets. Second, they inhibit the production of nitric oxide, which is also regulated by COX-2 to some degree and needed for proper vascular function. Finally, one more mechanism by which chronic NSAIDs may increase heart attack risk is through the disruption of mitochondrial function in heart cells. Knowing these risks sort of motivated me to put avoiding the use of NSAIDs such as ibuprofen, Aleve, and naproxen, just to name a few, at a generally higher priority than it may have been previously for me on a personal level. As an alternative to the use of NSAIDs, however, I found that curcumin is actually very helpful. Curcumin is sort of an interesting compound. It exhibits a pretty diverse array of potentially beneficial properties, but as a xenobiotic that the body actively makes an effort to get rid of, its activity can be limited unless care is taken to try to make it more bioavailable. There's a few different formulations that attempt to do that, but the one that I found most interesting is a formulation known as Meriva, which has been shown to exhibit certain pain-relieving properties. Meriva, a form which is available from a few well-known brands, consists of a phospholipid complex with 20% curcumin dispersed throughout the phospholipid. This helps to get the curcumin past the stomach lining and from being cleared by enzymes in the liver too rapidly. A few clinical trials have looked into the effects of Meriva on pain and inflammation. For example, runners that were given 1 gram of Meriva twice a day found that it reduced delayed onset muscle soreness by about twofold and caused a 60% decrease in markers of muscle damage and inflammation, specifically IL-8 and C-reactive protein, after running until exhaustion downhill. There have also been a couple of other clinical studies published looking at the efficacy of 1 gram of Mariva a day in reducing symptoms of osteoarthritis and increasing mobility. After 3 months of treatment, people with osteoarthritis and joint pain had a 4-fold increase in mobility, C-reactive protein decreased by 67%, and they had around a 58% reduction in arthritis symptoms, including pain. There was a similar study that included a longer follow-up, which was 8 months, and found similar increases in mobility and reductions in inflammation and pain. What's interesting is that Mariva has also been compared directly to common pain relievers in terms of ability to give pain relief in a small clinical study, which found that people taking 2 grams of Mariva a day experienced a pain relief equivalent to 1 gram of acetaminophen or Tylenol, an amount, by the way, which has been associated with liver damage in conjunction with long-term use. Another study also found that 2 grams a day of Mariva for 6 weeks was equivalent to around 800 milligrams a day of ibuprofen for pain relief. The study found that the analgesic effect of curcumin lasted for approximately 4 hours, and a second dose administered around 6 to 12 hours after the first dose was necessary for controlling pain. On the whole, curcumin is also a surprisingly safe compound. One study out of Japan published in 2011 in the Journal of Cancer Chemotherapy and Pharmacology showed that curcumin in amounts as high as even 8 grams per day for up to 14 days at a time was safe and tolerable. These were cancer patients, and this wasn't a Mariva formulation. However, seeing how well tolerated very high clinical doses are generally, for occasional pain relief, I tend to be pretty liberal with popping a few grams of curcumin in the form of Mariva throughout the day. There's a few popular brands offering Mariva or sometimes simply marketed as phytosomal curcumin. Right now, the one I'm taking is the product from Thorne. Again, like every other supplement brand I've ever mentioned on this podcast, no affiliation whatsoever. Since I've sort of put curcumin and Mariva out there specifically as a nice NSAID alternative, I need to address the gorilla in the room. Quite recently, a very sensational scientific review was making the rounds claiming that curcumin basically had no health benefits and that because of a quirk of an investigative method used to look at protein-protein interactions that may be subject to some degree of imprecision because of how it can behave in a manner that produces background noise, all curcumin research up until this point should be more or less considered null and void. That was sort of the crux of the argument, and a handful of unsuccessful trials were also cited to support, in my opinion, poorly this argument. The problem is that the specific quirk of the research assay being discussed is rendered absolutely and completely irrelevant in the context of the massive body of clinical curcumin research done in humans that has shown the compound is exceedingly versatile. Moreover, even if we put aside the enormous amount of clinical research, it's been demonstrated that curcumin works in a manner that, at the cellular level, exhibits broad changes in gene expression, something that cannot be dismissed simply because one specific assay, which, by the way, does not even measure gene expression, exhibits some degree of artifact. If you couldn't tell, I'm not a big fan of this particular review article published and may even feel a little bit of desire to sort of heap mountains of admonishment on the authors. That said, I will concede that there is a need for more double-blind placebo-controlled studies on curcumin, and specifically the Mariva phytosomal complex of curcumin, which does significantly bypass the bioavailability issues associated with the compound, which has also been the source of some criticism. I am, however, very, very optimistic about future research surrounding curcumin in general and Mariva in particular. Finally, one more thing I should bring up in the context of joint health is hydrolyzed collagen powder. What first sparked my interest in this was a study shared with me by a colleague that established the fact that, at least in an animal model, hydrolyzed collagen supplemented in the diet did find its way into the cartilage. Sometimes in nutrition, relationships don't tend to be so straightforward as it may seem intuitive on the surface. Cholesterol is a great example of this. We actually create cholesterol, and the consumption of dietary cholesterol is not necessarily strictly a cause of high cholesterol as we think of it. In the case of hydrolyzed collagen powder, however, the relationship does seem to be straightforward. The study to which I'm referring to used radio-labeled collagen, which allowed the scientists that were doing the investigation to see what happened after the hydrolyzed collagen was consumed. They saw two things happened: that the collagen ended up being broken down into amino acids, but more importantly, that some of it was also absorbed intact and shown to accumulate in cartilage long-term, which is pretty cool. So a little bit about collagen. Collagen is an important component of tendons, ligaments, cartilage, and skin, but also an important component of gums, muscle, and the gut. About 33% of collagen is made from proline and glycine, which most dietary protein sources are not especially high in. Proline may also have a special place in wound healing as well. The first 10 days after a wound recurs, proline levels at the site of the wound are 50% higher than plasma, which might suggest that proline is actively being transported to the site of the wound and probably a necessary part of the wound healing process. As an interesting aside, proline can also be used by the mitochondria to produce energy. It is converted to glutamate and alpha-ketoglutarate and used by mitochondria to produce energy. The reason this pathway exists is because during conditions when glucose levels drop, proline is actually released from connective tissue to be used to make energy. I've heard Tim mention Great Lakes brand hydrolyzed collagen powder, which happens to be the same brand that I've used for the last few years. It does not have any particularly strong taste, so it can pretty much be added to anything, including a beverage like tea or coffee or pretty much anything else. Okay, next question. Guy Fasciana asks, what brands can we trust for dietary supplement brands? How can we find trustworthy brands? This is a great question and an important question because the FDA does not require dietary supplements to be tested before they are marketed. As a result, products may contain unlisted ingredients and contaminants. Some products have even tested positive for prescription drugs not listed on the label. Many supplements do not contain what they're actually supposed to contain, and instead may be a combination of fillers like clover leaf. So there's a few things you can do. One thing you can do is make sure the product is certified by NSF International, which stands for the National Sanitary Foundation, which independently tests and certifies dietary supplements and nutritional products and ensures that they do not contain undeclared ingredients or contaminants. To earn NSF dietary supplement certification, products must undergo rigorous testing and inspection. The standard requires label claim testing, verification, and contaminant review and a facility audit. You can look for products containing the NSF label by searching their dietary supplements online product database found at info.nsf.org/certified/dietary. I usually will just type in the manufacturer name, for example, Nordic Naturals, or I will type in a specific product that I'm looking for, like Mariva. The drawback to relying on this particular certification is that their database can be pretty restrictive. While being in the NSF database is a good sign, not being in it strictly is not a deal breaker. So here's another option. Look for products that are USP certified. The USP, which stands for the United States Pharmacopoeial Convention, is a scientific nonprofit organization that sets standards for the quality and purity of dietary supplements that are manufactured, distributed, and consumed worldwide. In the United States, the FDA relies on standards the USP has developed. So you can just go to their website, which is usp.org, and click Verified Supplements to see a list of brands and products within brands that the USP verifies. In addition to the USP and NSF, there are independent companies that also test supplements and then rank those products and provide reports to customers, sometimes for a cost. However, I found these to be either misleading or sometimes coming to conclusions that give me pause. Doing the type of validation necessary may require technical skills that might be executed poorly, or sometimes just plain weird ranking criteria may be at play. For that reason, I don't trust these independent ranking companies as much, but absent other information, it may still be better than just blindly grabbing something off a supermarket shelf.